She was 26 years old, working a night shift in a hospital on the wrong side of the city. He was the most dangerous man in Boston, bleeding out on her floor with 5 armed men at his back. Every doctor ran, every guard disappeared, but she didn't move. She pulled on her gloves, looked him dead in those cold blue eyes, and said 4 words that would change her life forever. "I'll do it myself." She didn't know his name. She didn't know the war she was walking into. All she knew was that her hands were steady, and that, in a room full of monsters, that was the most powerful thing in the world. What happened next wasn't just a love story. It was a complete transformation. From a woman who saved lives to a woman who ruled an empire. The question is, what did she possess that even the most feared man in the city couldn't resist? Welcome to this channel, where we explore the world of the mafia boss. Some people are simply born to dominate. There are lessons that no classroom will ever teach you. Only those who have truly held power understand them. This channel doesn't tell stories about crime. This channel tells stories about mindset, about iron will, and about the secrets behind real, unshakable power. The lesson this story carries is this: calm is not weakness. It is the rarest weapon alive. In a room filled with guns, fear, and desperate men, the one person who held all the power was the woman whose hands never shook. Gabriel Costello had money, soldiers, and territory. But when he met a woman who looked at his bleeding wound and felt no awe, no terror, only focus, he was undone. The world will always try to intimidate you into smallness. Your greatest act of defiance is simply to remain steady. If this story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done in her place. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Like if you believe that real power lives in composure, not chaos. And subscribe, because every week on this channel, there is a new story waiting, one that will change the way you see yourself and the world around you.
I'd been working nights at Mercy General for about 6 months then, mostly to help out my mom. The hospital was this huge gray building on the edge of the south side, always buzzing with a kind of desperate energy. For Maddie Foster, though, that ER was her kingdom. She was only 26, but she moved through the chaos like she was born in it. Gunshots, car wrecks, you name it, she'd seen it, and it never seemed to faze her. She ran on coffee and this incredible calm. It was a Tuesday, a real downpour outside, which usually meant a quiet night. Dr. Croft, he was the attending, was already asleep at his desk. I remember watching Maddie restocking one of the trauma bays, her movements so precise. And then the doors didn't just open. They were practically ripped from their hinges. The whole ER, which had been so quiet, just exploded with noise and motion. 5 men, not like any I'd ever seen up close before, stormed in. They weren't patients. They were wearing these dark, expensive suits that were soaked from the rain, and they looked like they could break a man in half just by looking at him. The air changed instantly, you know? It got heavy. It smelled like wet wool and some fancy cologne, but underneath it all was the sharp, coppery smell of blood. In the middle of them was this one man, the one who was bleeding, and even though he looked like he was about to collapse, he had this incredible presence. I found out his name later, Gabriel Costello. But that night, all I knew was that he was important, and he was dangerous. He was tall, with this dark hair plastered to his head from the rain, and his white shirt was just soaked in red. It was terrifying. One of his men, a guy with a nasty scar across his eyebrow, was holding him up, but he was still trying to stand on his own. The man with the scar, Leo, started yelling for a doctor, and his voice was so rough and threatening that the poor receptionist just froze solid behind her desk. I remember ducking behind my push broom, trying to make myself as small as possible. He didn't even bother with the front desk. Leo just pulled Gabriel right past everyone, heading straight for the first trauma bay. That's when Dr. Croft woke up, and the look on his face was pure panic. You could see him clock the guns hidden under their jackets. He tried to stop them, tried to talk about protocol, but Leo just shoved him back. He told Croft to fix his boss or he'd start hurting people, and I believed him. Dr. Croft just stood there, stammering. Then I heard Maddie's voice. It was so steady, so calm. "Step aside, Harrison." She said it like she was asking him to pass the salt, not stepping in front of a group of armed mobsters. She walked right into that trauma bay, pulling on a pair of gloves like it was any other Tuesday night. She didn't even glance at the men with the guns, or at Leo's mean face. She looked right at Gabriel Costello, whose eyes were this crazy, intense blue, especially against how pale he was from losing so much blood. He was obviously in agony, but he never made a sound. She told them to get him on the bed, and when Leo challenged her, asking who she was, her answer was perfect. "I'm the person who's going to keep your boss from bleeding out on my floor." I saw it from the hallway, a tiny little nod from Gabriel, and his men lifted him onto the gurney. Maddie was on him in a second. She took these big scissors and just cut right through his expensive shirt, revealing this chest covered in muscles and tattoos. The wound was on his side, just under his ribs. I heard her ask about an exit wound, and I remember thinking how brave she was, how professional. She checked his back and said the bullet went straight through, but that a vein was torn and that's why he was losing so much blood. Dr. Croft, finally snapping out of his shock, started to move in, talking about needing to get him to an operating room. That's when everything got even crazier. "No." I heard the word from down the hall. It was Gabriel Costello's voice, deep and raspy, and it sent a chill right through me. His hand shot out and grabbed Dr. Croft's wrist, and even from where I was, I could see the strength in that grip. "No anesthesia, no operating room, do it here. Keep me awake." Dr. Croft was practically begging him, trying to explain that the pain would be unbearable, that he was in shock. But Costello just stared him down, his eyes turning to ice. "Do it here." And with Croft looking completely helpless, it was Maddie again who took control. "Lidocaine, lots of it," she said, turning to the medical supplies. "I'll do it, I hid in the supply closet near the trauma bay, peeking through the crack in the door. For the next 45 minutes, that room was the most tense place on earth. The armed men stood like statues at the door, and I could hear the hospital security guards making excuses to be anywhere else. I watched Maddie work. She was like a machine, her hands so steady as she cleaned the wound and started stitching him up. She warned him about the sting of the anesthetic, but Costello didn't even blink. He just laid there, watching her. Not the wound, not the ceiling, her. And I knew, right then, that this was more than just a patient and a nurse. Something was happening. He watched everything about her. The way her hands moved, the little frown of concentration on her face, even the way the bright lights caught the reddish strands of her hair. It was intense. I think, for a man like him, seeing someone who wasn't terrified of him was something new. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "You're very quiet, nurse." And Maddie, without missing a beat or even looking up from her work, just shot back. "Small talk distracts me, Mr. Costello." She told him that if she got distracted, he'd bleed, so they should just be quiet. I saw Leo, the guy with the scar, start to get angry at her nerve, but Costello just waved him off. He almost smiled. I saw it. Just a little twitch of his lips. When she finished, tying the last stitch and putting on the bandage, she gave him instructions like he was any other patient. Antibiotics. Rest. Of course, he ignored her. He just swung his legs off the bed and stood up, wincing from the pain. Leo rushed over to help him, putting a dry coat around his shoulders. Costello said to send the bill to some foundation, and I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say. It was a clear signal that he wasn't just some random guy who got shot in a back alley deal. Then he pulled out this thick wad of cash held together by a gold clip and tossed it on the tray next to the bloody supplies. "For your exceptional bedside manner," he said. And Maddie, bless her stubborn heart, just looked at the money and then back at him. "I get paid by the hospital, Mr. Costello. Take your tip with you. You could have heard a pin drop. From my hiding spot, I saw the faces of his men go rigid. No one ever said no to Gabriel Costello. He stepped right up to her. So close I thought he might hurt her, and his eyes got darker. The air crackled with a dangerous energy that scared me to my bones. He leaned in and whispered, "Keep it, nurse. Buy yourself a better cup of coffee." And before she could say another word, he was gone. He and his men just melted back into the rainy night, leaving behind the smell of blood, expensive cologne, and that pile of money on the tray. It was like they were never there. The police showed up about 20 minutes later, of course. By then, the floor was clean, and I watched Maddie put the money into the hospital's donation box. Dr. Croft was hiding in his office. When the detectives asked her what happened, she gave them nothing but the basics. A man with a wound, left against medical advice. She never mentioned the suits, the guns, or the name Costello. It wasn't about being on his side. It was about staying alive in a city where men like him made the rules. Far away from our little ER, in some fancy penthouse apartment, Gabriel Costello was getting looked at by his own private doctor. I learned all this later, piecing things together. His doctor was examining Maddie's work, the stitches she'd made under so much pressure, and he was impressed. He called them a work of art, perfect in their execution. I can just picture Costello sitting there, a glass of bourbon in his hand, listening to this doctor praise the hands of the nurse who wasn't afraid of him. That night wasn't just another emergency. It was the beginning of an obsession. He had found something rare in our chaotic ER, someone who saw the wound, not the monster, and he wasn't going to let that go. I remember that night so clearly, even all these years later. I was just the nurse who stitched him up. I had no idea that at that very moment, across the city in some gilded penthouse, my work was being critiqued. Gabriel told me later that his private doctor, a man named Evans, was just baffled by the suturing. He called it elite surgical control. Meanwhile, Gabriel wasn't even listening. He was staring into a glass of bourbon while his right-hand man, Leo, was getting the news. It was the Russians, the Sokolov family. They'd set an ambush. He told me if he hadn't turned to light a cigar at that exact second, the bullet would have gone straight through his heart. That's how close it was. Gabriel always described that moment with a chilling sort of calm. He said the rage was there, but it was cold, not hot. He saw it as a direct insult, this idea that Viktor Sokolov thought he could move on the Costello family just because Gabriel's father was gone. That's when he gave the order that would change everything for me. He told Leo to burn Sokolov's warehouses on the docks that very night, just like that. And Leo, loyal as ever, just said, "Consider it done." But as Leo was leaving, Gabriel stopped him. He told me his mind wasn't on the war he'd just started. It was back in that sterile, harshly lit trauma bay with me. He remembered the little things, you see, things I never would have thought a man like him would notice. He told me he could still smell the cheap vanilla lotion I used under the sharp scent of the iodine cleaning his wound. He remembered the color of my hair and the shape of my face, how I looked at him without an ounce of fear or awe. And he remembered my nameplate, the one that just said M. Foster. When Leo asked if he should send someone to make sure I kept quiet, Gabriel said no. He told Leo, "She won't talk, she's smart." But it was never about whether I would talk. It was about something else entirely. What he confessed to me, years and years later, was that my competence was what truly unsettled him. In his world of violence and shifting loyalties, everyone was predictable. They were either scared, greedy, or trying to manipulate him. But I wasn't. I held his life in my hands with a pair of surgical scissors, and my hands were perfectly steady. He saw that I knew who he was, that I knew the danger, and yet I did my job with a pure, unshakable focus. To him, that kind of calm was a foreign power, something he couldn't buy or intimidate. He didn't want to silence me. He wanted to understand me. He wanted to own that stillness. And that's when he gave the real order. Find her. Of course, I knew nothing about any of this. I just knew I was exhausted. I unlocked the door to my tiny walk-up, my whole body humming with the fatigue of 2 straight 12-hour shifts since the Costello incident. All I wanted was a hot shower and to forget the whole thing. I remember collapsing on my sofa, turning on the TV just for the noise, trying to push the image of his intense blue eyes out of my head. But it was impossible. My world felt tainted. And then a news report came on about a massive fire at the shipping docks, and my blood ran cold. I knew, honey. I just knew that somehow my stitches were tied to that smoke. The real fear started on the third day. It was subtle at first, like a change in the air you can't quite place. I went to a little diner for breakfast, a place I'd been going for years, and I saw it. A big black Lincoln Navigator, parked across the street, windows so dark you couldn't see inside. It just sat there, humming. Later that day, at the grocery store, I saw a man in a ridiculously expensive suit just lingering by the apples. He didn't belong in my neighborhood, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a feeling of being watched, of my private little world being invaded by something powerful and unseen. The moment it became undeniable was at the checkout counter. My debit card was declined. I felt that hot flush of panic and embarrassment, fumbling for another card, but before I could, that man in the charcoal suit stepped up beside me. He didn't say a word. He just tapped a sleek black credit card on the machine, gave me this polite but utterly empty nod, and walked out. I was so stunned I just stood there for a second before chasing after him, yelling. But he was gone, swallowed up by the afternoon crowd. By the time I got to my shift at the hospital, I felt like my own skin was crawling. Paranoia wasn't just a feeling, it was a passenger inside my chest. I must have looked a fright because the first thing Dr. Croft said to me was, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I brushed it off, of course, but then he leaned in with the hospital gossip. He told me the administration had just received a $2 million anonymous donation, specifically for our emergency department. My stomach literally dropped to the floor. Untraceable cash like that in a city like Boston? It could only come from one place. I felt sick, like I'd been paid for something I didn't agree to sell. I spent that entire shift in a daze, just going through the motions, counting the seconds until I could run home and bolt my door. The hospital parking garage was always creepy at 6 in the morning, all shadows and echoes. As I walked toward my beat-up old Honda, I felt it again, that intense feeling of being watched. It wasn't just empty silence. It was a loaded, waiting silence. I sped up, jamming my keys between my fingers like I'd seen in self-defense videos. It was useless, of course. Just as I reached my car, they stepped out from behind a pillar. 3 of them. They weren't Gabriel's men in their tailored suits. These men were different, rougher. The leader, with a thick Russian accent and a butterfly knife, said my name. My full name. He knew who I was. They told me they knew I was the one who put Gabriel Costello back together. My mind was racing, trying to find an escape, trying to lie my way out of it. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, that I treat dozens of people. But they knew. Their boss, Viktor Sokolov, wanted to know everything Gabriel had said to me, where he was hiding. I was screaming at them that he said nothing, but they didn't believe me. When the leader ordered them to grab me, to take me somewhere quiet to help me remember, I thought I was going to die right there on the cold concrete. One of them grabbed me, his hand clamped over my mouth, and the world just dissolved into pure terror. He slammed me against the hood of my own car. But just as he started to drag me, I heard this sound. A soft, strange little pop. Thwip. Twice. The man holding me just stopped. A perfect little red circle appeared on his forehead, and he fell away from me. It happened so fast. Another one of them went for a gun, but a shadow moved out of the darkness and a steel pipe shattered his knee. The sound it made is something I'll never forget. It was brutal and sickening, and at that moment, it was the sound of my rescue. Then, suddenly, the garage was full of them. Men in dark suits, armed, moving with silent efficiency. The man with the pipe, the one I would come to know as Leo, calmly holstered a silenced pistol. He didn't even look at me. I just slid down the side of my car, shaking so hard I couldn't feel my legs, trying to breathe in air that tasted like gunpowder. And then I heard the footsteps. Slow, confident, echoing across the pavement. A figure emerged from the shadows next to a black SUV. He was wearing this beautiful tailored overcoat, his neck bandaged beneath a silk scarf. Even with a slight stiffness in his walk, he owned that entire space. It was him, Gabriel Costello. He walked right up to me, his eyes glancing at the dead man on the ground before they locked onto mine. They were so cold, so blue. He crouched down in front of me, and I saw him wince just a little from the wound I had stitched. Then he reached out and took my chin in his hand, tilting my face up so I had to look at him. His hand was so warm against my cold skin. He gently brushed a smudge of dirt from my cheek with his thumb, and his voice. His voice was like dark velvet. He said, "I told you. The city is dangerous at night, Nurse Foster." And I just stared into his eyes, trembling. My first coherent thought was outrage. "You were having me followed?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. He corrected me so softly it was almost a caress. "I was having you guarded." And in that moment, the way his grip on my chin tightened just enough to feel possessive, I understood. This wasn't a rescue in the way normal people think of it. Sokolov's men had found me because of him, because they were trying to get to him. He then stood up, this impossibly tall shadow over me, and offered me his hand. "Your shift is over, Maddie," he said, using my first name for the very first time. "You're coming with me. I didn't have a choice." Even now, so many years later, there are certain smells that take me right back to that night. Gunpowder and rain on hot asphalt. I can almost feel the damp chill of that parking garage, the terror that felt like a permanent part of my nervous system. And him, Gabriel Costello, sitting next to me in the back of that armored SUV. He wasn't a man, not then. He was this perfectly still thing carved from expensive wool and barely contained violence. I watched the streetlights of the I-94 blur into streaks of neon, while he just stared out the window, his jaw so tight I was sure it would crack. He hadn't said a single word since his men bundled me into the car, just pointed north, leaving my city, my life, behind. The silence was louder than any gunshot. The estate wasn't a house. It was a declaration of war. A fortress of glass and steel clinging to a cliff over a furious Lake Michigan. It made you feel small and insignificant. When we finally stopped in a garage that felt more like a bunker, Gabriel turned to me. Under the harsh white lights, his face was the color of bleached bone. And his scarf, a beautiful silk thing, was soaked, absolutely saturated with fresh blood. My own clumsy stitching, the work I'd done in the ER, had been torn apart by the fight in the garage. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a rasp of pure agony. "Get out." And my brain, oh my foolish, clinical brain, ignored the sheer terror and just said, "You're bleeding again." It was the only thing I knew how to do, you see. Be a nurse. I was expecting a dungeon, a basement, something from a movie. Instead, his men led me to a room that looked like a private, state-of-the-art surgical suite. It was cleaner and better equipped than the trauma bay I'd just left. That was the first time I truly understood the kind of power he had. It wasn't just about guns. It was about the ability to build a hospital wing in his basement. His man, Leo, helped him out of his coat, and I saw the damage. The right side of his chest was a ruin of blood and torn muscle. The sutures I'd so carefully placed had ripped right through. I remember washing my hands, the warm water a small comfort, and hearing my own voice, shaking just a little, taking charge. "I need my kit," I said, "and you need to lie down before you pass out." He gave me this look, a look that could stop a man's heart from across a room. "I don't pass out," he said, and the sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. He was literally bleeding to death on his own floor, and his pride was the first thing he chose to defend. I'll tell you, honey, that was the moment a tiny piece of the old me woke up. The nurse in me, the one who dealt with 1,000 stubborn, scared men, took over. Biology doesn't care about your ego, Mr. Costello. Lie down. For a split second, I thought he might kill me right there. But then Leo, his soldier, let out this sharp bark of a laugh. Gabriel's glare shut him up instantly, but he listened to me. He lay down. And for the second time in my life, I was elbows deep in a mafia boss's blood. The quiet rhythm of the work, the familiar pull of needle and thread, it calmed the shaking in my hands. It was the only thing that felt real in that insane situation. And in that quiet, I finally asked the question that had been screaming in my mind. You saved my life tonight. Why? I think a part of me, the naive part that was dying a very fast death, wanted to hear something noble. But Gabriel Costello wasn't a hero in a storybook. He never even looked away from my face when he answered, his blue eyes pinning me down. You think I would let Viktor Sokolov take something that belongs to me? The needle froze in my hand. Not a person, not a life. Something. I was something that belonged to him. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he destroyed what was left of my world. Your apartment was compromised 3 hours ago. It's a funny thing, the way your world can just end. Not with a bang, but with a few cold, quiet words from a monster. He described what Sokolov's men did to my apartment, my little sanctuary, and I felt the oxygen leave the planet. My first thought, so laughably innocent, was to call the police. It was Leo who answered, his voice devoid of any pity. He explained the world to me in 2 sentences. The cops were either owned by them, owned by the Russians, or too scared to get involved. For a nurse caught between 2 mobs, there was no help coming. I remember dropping my scissors on the tray. The clang echoed in the silent room. That was the sound of every door in my life slamming shut and locking from the outside. I was trapped. He sat up on the table, slow and deliberate, ignoring the fresh stitches pulling at his skin. He didn't reach for a shirt. He reached for me. I flinched, expecting a blow, but his hand wrapped around my wrist with a grip that wasn't painful, just absolute. It was the kind of hold that says, "You are mine now, and there is no escape." He pulled me between his knees, and the heat coming off his bare chest was overwhelming. He looked right into my eyes, and his voice dropped to this low, hypnotic rumble. He told me it was his fault my enemies found me, and that in his house I was untouchable. He was offering protection, a gilded cage, and asking me to be grateful for it. And what happens when you don't need to protect me anymore? I whispered. The look on his face told me we would never cross that bridge. Those next few days were the loneliest of my life. I was living in a palace, a prisoner in a 5-star hotel. He gave me a suite with a view of the lake that people pay thousands a night for. And the closet, it was filled with designer clothes, all in my exact size. Can you imagine how terrifying that is? To know this man had investigated every detail of your life, from your dress size to your favorite color, all without your knowledge. It wasn't a kindness, it was a statement of control. I was free to wander the house, this beautiful, silent mausoleum, but his men were always there, politely steering me away from the rooms where he conducted his business. I was a ghost in his world, a prize he had won and put on a shelf. The quiet of the house finally broke on the 3rd day. I was in this enormous library, surrounded by thousands of books I couldn't focus on, when the doors were thrown open with a crash. 2 of his soldiers were dragging a man between them, a man who was bruised and sobbing. They threw him onto the floor like a sack of garbage, and my heart just stopped. It was Dr. Harrison Croft, my supervising physician from the hospital. His expensive suit was torn, his face was a swollen mess, and he was weeping. And then Gabriel walked in behind them, looking like he'd just stepped out of a magazine. He was perfectly healed, radiating this freezing, absolute authority that sucked all the air out of the room. My first instinct, even then, was to be a doctor. I saw Dr. Croft on the floor, bleeding, and my training took over. I stepped forward, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. "Gabriel, what is this?" I asked, still clinging to the idea that this was some horrible mistake. but Gabriel's eyes were fixed on the trembling man on his Persian rug. "Maddie!" Croft wailed, spitting blood. Tell them I didn't mean it." Gabriel walked calmly towards him and unbuttoned his suit jacket. He never raised his voice. "Tell her, Harrison," he said, and the words were like chips of ice. "Tell the nice nurse how the Russian mob knew exactly which parking garage she used and what time her shift ended." And just like that, the world fell out from under me again. You know, betrayal is a physical thing. I felt it in my throat, a sharp, jagged pill that I couldn't swallow. Harrison Croft, the man who had mentored me, who'd written my letters of recommendation for nursing school. He was the one. He was the reason I was almost killed, the reason I was now a prisoner in this house. He pulled himself to his knees, begging, talking about gambling debts, about how the Russians were going to break his hands. He'd sold my life to save his own fingers. He swore all they wanted was a name, that he didn't know they'd try to kill me. But it didn't matter. He had pointed them to me. He had traded my safety for a seat at a poker table. Leo, ever the efficient second in command, tossed a thick envelope onto the coffee table. It was full of pictures. Croft taking a briefcase from a man I'd later learn was a Russian lieutenant. The proof was absolute, ugly, and undeniable. Gabriel looked down at the pathetic creature blubbering at his feet, and his voice was the calmest, most terrifying thing I had ever heard. It wasn't loud, it was just final. "You sold her," he said. "You sold the woman who saved my life to the men trying to take it." Croft was screaming then, promising to work for him, to be his private doctor, pleading about his family. But Gabriel wasn't listening. He was just looking at him with this profound, chilling disappointment. And then, he turned that terrifying calm on me. Every man in that room, these killers in tailored suits, they all turned to look at me. The silence was deafening. He was handing me a loaded gun, asking me to pull the trigger. "This is the man who sent the wolves to your door, Maddie. What do you want me to do with him?" It was a test, you see. He wasn't asking for my opinion. He was asking for my allegiance. He wanted to know if the soft, naive nurse could be reshaped to fit into his brutal world. I looked at Croft, at the man who had sold me for cash, and I felt nothing. The part of me that believed in oaths and second chances had been murdered in that parking garage. I still hear my own voice from that moment in my nightmares sometimes. It didn't sound like me. It was cold, steady, and dead. "He values his hands," I said. "He always bragged that his hands were worth millions. That's how he pays his debts." The faintest hint of a smile touched Gabriel's lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of recognition, like a predator seeing its own reflection in the eyes of its prey. He looked at me, and in that moment, he knew he had me. He gave the order to his men, his eyes never leaving mine. "Take him to the basement, and make sure Dr. Croft never holds a scalpel again." The last thing I remember is Croft's screams as they dragged him out. I didn't feel relief or pity, I just felt cold. That was the night the old me was buried for good. I still remember the sound of those heavy doors slamming shut, a boom that echoed in a silence so thick you could feel it. You have to understand, that was the first time I truly felt the weight of his world. Croft's shrieks were cut off, and in that quiet, I felt a kind of terrible satisfaction. I stood there, my own hands trembling, staring at the spot on the rug where a man had bled because of me. I had just sentenced him to a fate worse than death, and the most terrifying part was that I didn't feel an ounce of regret. Later that night, a storm rolled in that seemed born from the violence of the evening, rattling the windows of that lakeside palace, and I went out on the balcony to meet it. I stood on that balcony overlooking the churning black water of Lake Michigan, letting the wind and the cold rain whip my hair across my face. I was trying to wash away the thoughts, you see, trying to numb the terrifying thrill that was singing in my veins. Downstairs, a man was being broken because he had crossed me, and the sheer unholy power of that fact was a poison and a tonic all at once. It scared me more than anything ever had. Then I heard the door slide open. I didn't need to turn. Even over the storm, I could feel him. A shift in the very air itself, a charge of electricity that belonged only to Gabriel. He stepped out, having shed the armor of his suit, looking almost mortal. He just stood there beside me for a moment, the two of us watching the lightning dance on the waves. He didn't need to shout. His voice cut right through the thunder. "It is done," he said, and I knew he meant Croft was ruined, a ghost who would haunt the halls of a hospital he could never work in again. I gripped that cold, wet stone railing until my knuckles were white and asked him a question that sounds so naive to me now. "Does it ever bother you, the violence?" I remember how the lightning flashed across his face as he turned to me, making him look like some ancient, beautiful statue. "Violence isn't a choice in my world, Maddie," he said. "It's the currency." My own voice shook when I finally asked it. "And what am I?" I'll never forget the way his eyes changed then, going from calm to the color of the storm in a heartbeat. He moved so fast, closing the space between us and backing me against the cold, hard stone of the balustrade. The rain was soaking him instantly, plastering his shirt to his chest, but he didn't even seem to feel it. "You think this is a cage?" he murmured, his voice low and dangerous, his face so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. "If I wanted a pet, I would buy a dog." And then his entire demeanor shifted. "You aren't a captive, Maddie. You are a revelation." His hands, the same hands that commanded such brutality, came up to cup my face with a tenderness that nearly broke me. His touch was so gentle, a stark, agonizing contrast to the monster I knew he was. "For 35 years, he whispered, and his voice was raw with something I'd never heard from him before. A lifetime of loneliness packed into a single breath. I've been surrounded by people who want my money, my power, or my blood." He looked right into my soul then. "You were the first person who looked at me while I was bleeding and saw a man, not a monster or a payday." I tried to tell him I was terrified, and I was, but he just shook his head. "But your hands were steady," he said, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "I can't let you go back to the mundane world, Maddie. You belong in the dark, with me." And just like that, he kissed me. It wasn't a gentle kiss, not a first kiss from a movie. It was a claim. It tasted of rain and bourbon, and a desperation so profound it stole the air from my lungs. Every instinct I had screamed at me to push him away, and my hands came up to his chest to do just that. But the moment I touched him, felt the solid, unyielding muscle beneath his wet shirt, something inside me broke. The fight just went out of me. I tangled my fingers in his hair and kissed him back with a kind of reckless hunger that I didn't even know I possessed. It was a surrender, a willing fall. I was kissing the devil himself, and I was letting him pull me down into his beautiful, terrible hell. When we finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, and one word rumbled from his chest, a fierce whisper against the storm. "Mine." That one word sealed my fate. It should have been a threat, a brand, but in that moment, it felt like a promise. But our world, the world he had pulled me into, never allowed for peace. The balcony doors slid open with a jarring violence, and there was Leo, his face a mask of panic I had never seen on him before. "Boss," he yelled over the wind, "we have a massive problem." Just like that, the lover was gone, and the cold, calculating syndicate boss stood in his place, the storm in his eyes returning with a vengeance. I remember the name Leo said next felt like a shard of ice in the humid air. Sokolov. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't just about business anymore. Leo explained that while Gabriel's men were dealing with Croft, the Russians had made their real move. A strike team had hit the South Docks. Gabriel was unfazed at first, talking about losing a shipment, about retaliation, but it was never about a shipment. "They hit the safe house where your sister Sophia was staying," Leo said, his voice grim. "They took her." My heart stopped. Sokolov had sent a video, a demand. Gabriel was to go to an old steel mill in Indiana, alone, or they would send his sister back to him in pieces. The storm outside was chaos. But it was nothing compared to the terrifying stillness that fell over Gabriel. The man who had been all fire and passion moments before became a creature of ice. Every bit of warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, murderous promise that made my blood run cold. He didn't even look at me as he started walking back inside, his voice dangerously low as he gave Leo the order to lock down the estate. I ran after him, my voice pleading. "You can't go alone. It's a trap!" He stopped in the doorway and looked back at me, and in the shadows he looked like death itself. "I know it is," he said, "but they have my blood. And before the sun comes up, Viktor Sokolov is going to drown in his own." The hours that followed were the longest of my life, even longer than the ones I spent waiting for my own father to die. After Gabriel left, the thunderstorm faded away, leaving a thick, suffocating fog that wrapped around the house like a shroud. The gilded cage he had spoken of suddenly felt like a tomb. I couldn't just sit and wait. I couldn't let my mind wander to the horrors unfolding in some abandoned steel mill. So I went to the one place where I had control, the subterranean medical bay. I worked for hours, cleaning, sterilizing, preparing for his return. I laid out trauma kits and IV bags filled with his rare blood type. It was the only prayer I knew how to offer. Outside the reinforced doors of my clinic, the estate had transformed. The quiet luxury was gone, replaced by the grim efficiency of a fortress preparing for a siege. Men in tactical gear with rifles patrolled the halls where butlers usually walked. The tension was a living thing, a predator stalking the corridors. And then, at 14 minutes past 5 in the morning, the silence was shattered by the crackle of a radio. It was Leo's voice, raw and strained with adrenaline. "Gates! Open the gates! We have wounded!" My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady as I hit the intercom. The only thing that mattered was the answer to my next question. And then it came. "The boss is hit." In that moment, the fear that had been gnawing at me all night simply vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I was no longer the woman who had surrendered on the balcony. I was a trauma nurse. This was my battlefield. Minutes later, the clinic doors burst open and the war spilled in. It was organized chaos, a ballet of blood and pain. 2 of his men were carried in on stretchers, their bodies torn apart by high-caliber rounds. But my training took over, my mind triaging, assessing, planning. I didn't have time for the horror. I was snapping on gloves, calling out orders for plasma and pressure bandages, moving through the carnage with a purpose that felt like the only sane thing in a world gone mad. And then I looked up, and he walked in. It's a sight I will carry with me to my grave. Gabriel looked like he had personally torn down the gates of hell. His coat was shredded, his face was a mask of soot and blood, some his, most not. But he wasn't broken. He was a conqueror. And held against his chest, cradled like the most precious thing in the world, was his sister, Sophia. She was alive, conscious, but her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was heartbreaking. She was clinging to him, this terrifying man who had just waded through fire for her. His eyes, though, they weren't on his men or the chaos. They found mine across the room, and he walked straight toward me. "Maddie," he grunted, his voice a raw, gravelly sound that spoke of exhaustion and pain. He bypassed the empty gurneys, his only focus on getting his sister to me. "Put her down," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument, as I pointed to the nearest table. He laid her down with a gentleness that was so at odds with the warrior standing before me. Sophia was sobbing, curling into herself, and he immediately tried to reassure me. "She's not shot," he said, his own breathing ragged. "They hit her, mostly shock." I was already working, checking her pupils, feeling her ribs, my mind a checklist of potential injuries. It was only when I looked up to tell him I needed to sedate her that I truly saw him. He was leaning against the counter, and a pool of dark blood was growing rapidly on the white floor beneath his left arm. I still remember the sound his boots made on the cheap clinic tiles, a wet, scraping noise that cut through the ringing in my ears. He was trying so hard to hide it, you see, to be the untouchable king. "You're hit," I said, and the words sounded so small, so inadequate for the man bleeding in front of me. He lied, of course. A graze, with that jaw of his clenched so tight I thought it would shatter. It was Leo, bless his loyal heart, who limped in and broke the spell, barking the truth about the AK-47 round. That was the first time I saw the mask truly slip. The moment Gabriel Costello let himself be just a man, exhausted and bleeding on a stool in my little clinic. For the next 3 hours, my world shrank to the size of that small room, a whirlwind of blood, antiseptic, and desperation. I moved on autopilot, a machine built of sutures and gauze, patching up his men so they could be whisked away by some back alley surgeon. And then, finally, it was just the two of us. The adrenaline drained out of me and left a hollow, aching exhaustion in its place. But looking at him, so still and pale on that stool, something else sparked to life inside me. You have to understand, it wasn't pity. It was a fierce, almost savage, protective fire. A feeling that would come to define the rest of my life, starting at that very moment. I picked up the trauma shears, the cold steel a familiar weight in my hand, and told him to take off his coat. He opened his eyes, and even through the haze of pain, they were so sharp, so focused on me. That's when he told me, not with pride, not with any kind of boast, but as a simple, brutal fact. Viktor Sokolov is dead. He said he'd done it himself, that his lieutenants were gone, and that they wouldn't hunt me anymore. In that instant, I realized the massacre. The river of blood that had flowed through the city that night wasn't just about his sister. It was for me, too. To avenge the violation of my sanctuary, my little clinic, it was terrifying. I asked him to lift his arm, and my voice came out as a whisper. He actually listened, wincing as he moved. As I cut away the expensive, ruined fabric of his suit, I saw the wound. It was nasty, a deep, gouging tear through his shoulder, but he'd been lucky. The bullet had missed everything vital. I remember the silence as I cleaned it, the sting of the antiseptic, the smell of gunpowder and blood. It was so different from the suffocating quiet in the car earlier. This was a heavy, charged silence, pulling us together like gravity. "You could have died," I murmured, my hands steady as I injected the anesthetic, knowing how empty the words were. "I told you I wouldn't," he said, and I almost believed him. I tried to argue, to tell him he wasn't immortal, but his reply stole the air from my lungs. "I am as long as I have you to put me back together." Then his uninjured hand came up, his fingers wrapping around my hip, and he pulled me just a little closer, right between his knees. The heat from his body soaked through my scrubs, and my hands started to tremble as I stitched the torn muscle. He promised he'd be more careful, because he'd suddenly found a reason to value his life. And I knew right then and there that he meant me. I was his reason. When I tied off that last suture, my whole body was trembling. His hand was this heavy, possessive weight on my hip, and I couldn't look away from his eyes. I saw it all there, the monster, the king, and a terrifying devotion aimed directly at me. He had found his weakness, and he was handing it to me, letting me see the one thing that could undo him. Instead of pulling away, I reached up and touched his face. "You are a dangerous man, Gabriel Costello," I whispered. And his response, pressing his forehead to my stomach in this gesture of complete surrender, sealed my fate. "And you," he said, "are my salvation." In the 2 weeks that followed, the world outside the Costello estate seemed to fade away. Gabriel's war had been swift and brutal, and he was now the undisputed king of the city's underworld. But that kind of power, I learned, comes with a deep corrosive paranoia. I couldn't go back to my old life, to my job at the hospital. He made it clear that just by knowing him, I was a target. I was no longer Maddie, the nurse. I was the woman who lived in the Don's house. The strange thing is, I never once felt like a prisoner. He left the cage door wide open, but I found I had no desire to fly away from him. I spent most of my days with his sister, Sophia. We found an easy friendship in the quiet gardens of the estate, a bond forged in the aftermath of violence. She was tiny, but she had a will of steel, and she understood her brother in a way no one else could. I remember one afternoon, she was sipping an espresso, and she looked at me with these incredibly sharp, knowing eyes. "You need to understand something about my brother," she told me, and I leaned in because I knew her words were important. She was offering me a key, a guide to navigating the beautiful, dangerous man I was falling for. "Gabriel doesn't do anything by half measures," Sophia explained, her voice low. "He doesn't love, he obsesses. He doesn't protect, he hoards." I told her I wasn't a possession, and she agreed, but she said I was something more important. "You are his anchor," she said. She told me that before I came along, the violence was consuming him and that I had somehow brought him back from the brink. But then she warned me, and I can still hear her voice in my memory. "Be prepared." The capos, his captains, were restless. They didn't like an outsider, a civilian, having so much influence over their boss. Her warning came true that very night. Gabriel called a meeting of his highest-ranking men, the capo regimes, in the grand dining room. I was usually hidden away during these things, a ghost in the house. But tonight, he had asked me to be there. I remember descending the staircase in a dark emerald silk gown he'd had made for me. It felt less like a dress and more like armor. The moment I stepped into that room, filled with the 10 most ruthless men in the city, the talking stopped. Complete silence. Every single pair of eyes turned to me, and the air grew thick with cigar smoke and judgment. Gabriel was at the head of the table, looking like a king in a perfectly tailored suit. When his eyes met mine, the cold, hard mask he wore for his men just melted away, replaced by this dark, possessive hunger that made my heart pound. He stood and pulled out the chair to his right. You have to understand the significance of that. It was the seat of his underboss, his most trusted advisor. It was a declaration. In a room full of men who lived and breathed by tradition and hierarchy, he placed me at his side. Leo, standing by the fireplace, gave me a small, respectful nod, the only ally I had in that den of wolves. Then an older capo named Carlo, a man who had served Gabriel's father, cleared his throat. He spoke of respect, but his words were a direct challenge. He said I was just a nurse, a civilian who had no place at a table where blood business was discussed. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Gabriel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just looked at Carlo with this profound, terrifying emptiness and asked so softly it was almost a whisper, "Are you questioning my judgment?" The question hung in the air, a threat more potent than any weapon he could have drawn on the man. Carlo pushed back, sweating but defiant, talking about the security of the family, calling me an outsider who knew too much. He said I hadn't taken the oath, that I wasn't one of them. And as Gabriel began that slow, predatory walk down the length of the table toward him, I felt the moment pivot. I could feel the weight of history, of tradition, pushing me to stay silent, to be the protected woman, the pet. But the woman I was becoming, the woman who had stared down death and stitched up a king, knew that silence would define me as a liability forever. A choice had to be made, right there, right then. So I stepped forward. "Carlo, isn't it?" My voice cut through the silence, clear and steady, and I saw Gabriel stop in his tracks. He turned, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. First surprise, then this dark, burning pride that seemed to set my skin on fire. I didn't look at my protector, though. I walked toward the center of the room and looked directly into Carlo's eyes. "You want to talk about security?" I began, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Let's talk about how your secure syndicate let the Russians walk into our city and nearly kill your boss." This was my oath, my declaration of loyalty. I remember that moment like it was etched in glass. Carlo, so used to being feared, was puffing up his chest, ready to put me in my place. But before he could get a word out, something cold and hard settled in my voice. I reminded them that it was my hands, not theirs, that kept their boss from bleeding out on a dirty floor. I looked around that opulent dining room, at those men in their expensive suits, and I told them I knew exactly who they were because I was the one who stitched up their mistakes and cleaned up their bloody messes. I leaned forward, my hands flat on that heavy oak table, and I reminded Carlo of the night a Russian thug held a blade to my throat and how I hadn't given them up. I had to make him understand I wasn't some fragile civilian anymore. I was the reason Gabriel was still alive. The silence that fell over that room was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. You see, talking to a capo like that, with that level of defiance, was usually a one-way ticket to a shallow grave. When I finally dared to look back at Gabriel, he was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was awe. It was like he was seeing me for the first time, not as the nurse he'd kidnapped, but as something else entirely. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across his lips, full of pride and a lethality that sent a chill down my spine. He walked back to his place at the head of the table, stood right behind me, and rested his hands on my shoulders. The weight of them was possessive, a clear signal to every man in that room. His voice, when he spoke, had the finality of a judge's gavel. He declared to everyone that I wasn't just a guest in his home, but the very blood of the syndicate, and that my word now carried the full weight of his authority. The message was unmistakable. Disrespecting me was the same as disrespecting him. You could feel the reluctance in the air, but their chorus of "Understood, boss" was absolute. When he pulled my chair out for me to sit again, the way they looked at me had completely changed. They no longer saw a scared nurse caught in their world. In their eyes, I had become the Donna, their queen. And just like that, as autumn set in across Boston, turning the leaves to crimson, a new season began inside that mansion as well. Those next 6 months, my child, were a trial by fire. It was a hard, violent transition from saving lives in an emergency room to navigating the politics of a criminal empire. But I learned quickly. I didn't just survive, I found a new purpose. With Gabriel's seemingly endless resources, I built a secret network of clinics across the city. Officially, they were for our own soldiers, a place to get patched up without a paper trail. But quietly, I made sure they also served the poor communities, the ones the official city hospitals had long since forgotten about. I brought my own code of ethics into their world, establishing rules of engagement. I insisted on no civilian casualties, no collateral damage. And Gabriel, to my constant surprise, enforced them. Our family, because that's what it had become, was still a criminal enterprise, of course, but it operated with a strange new kind of honor. The night of the annual syndicate gala was the culmination of all that change. It was a glittering, high-stakes affair where power was put on full display. I remember standing in front of a massive mirror in the hotel penthouse, looking at a woman I barely recognized. I was wearing a black velvet gown, and around my neck was a heavy diamond necklace that had once belonged to Gabriel's mother. It felt like I was wearing the weight of his entire family history. It was a long way from the tired, overworked nurse I used to be. The woman in the mirror was confident, untouchable. I didn't need to see his reflection to know Gabriel had entered the room. I could feel the shift in the air, the familiar charge of his presence. He was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the embodiment of dark power. He came up behind me without a word, his reflection joining mine, and wrapped his arms around my waist. He pulled me back against his chest, the warmth of his body a solid wall behind me, and he buried his face in my neck. His touch was no longer just a threat or a claim. It was home. The world outside could be chaos, but in his arms there was a strange and profound sense of peace. He held me for a long moment, just breathing, a silent communication that spoke volumes more than words ever could. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low murmur against my skin, sending a shiver through me. He told me I looked like a woman who could burn the entire city to the ground with a single word. And the scariest part? I knew he was right. I leaned back into his embrace, my hands covering his where they were clasped at my waist. I told him I'd only do it if the city deserved it. A dark, rumbling chuckle vibrated through his chest and into my back. He turned me to face him, his intense blue eyes studying my face with a kind of reverence that was both terrifying and intoxicating. For a man who commanded killers, he looked at me with the unwavering devotion of a true believer. He reminded me, his voice soft, that 6 months ago I had called him a monster. And I smiled, a real smile, because it was true. He had stormed into my emergency room, bled all over my clean floors, and ripped me from my life. But looking at him now, I saw everything he was: the killer, the ruthless king of a criminal underworld, and I also saw the man who would tear that world apart to protect me. I tangled my fingers in his hair and pulled his face down to mine. I told him, "Now, you are my monster." That was all it took. He closed the distance between us, his mouth crashing down on mine in a kiss that was pure possession, a culmination of everything we had survived and built together. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a promise made in the shadows, far more binding than any church vow. He lifted me off the ground with an ease that always surprised me, carrying me away from the mirror, completely ignoring the fact that a ballroom of powerful criminals was waiting for us downstairs. When he finally, reluctantly, set me back on my feet, our breaths were ragged. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't get on one knee. That wasn't Gabriel's way. He bowed to no one. But I saw his hands, the same hands that had ended lives without a second thought, tremble just slightly as he opened it. Inside wasn't a diamond. It was a huge, flawless, blood-red ruby, surrounded by tiny black diamonds. It looked like a perfect, frozen drop of blood. He told me he'd been wrong when he said I belonged in the dark with him. He said that I was the light that made his darkness bearable. And then he asked me to marry him, to take his name, his empire, his entire life. It was his way of telling the world that I wasn't just standing behind him anymore. I was standing right beside him as his equal. I stared at that ring, a perfect symbol of our twisted, violent, and beautiful story. I thought about the clean, sterile life I'd left behind, the white scrubs and the predictable routine of the hospital, and I realized with absolute certainty that I didn't miss it for a single second. I looked up from the ring and into his eyes. There were tears forming, but I refused to let them fall. This moment was about strength, not sentiment. I held out my left hand, a silent command. "Put it on me," I said, my voice soft but firm. A devastating smile broke across his face. He slid the heavy ruby onto my finger, and the cold metal seemed to warm instantly against my skin. He raised my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles, not like a lover, but like a king swearing an oath to his queen. He offered me his arm and asked if we should go keep the wolves waiting, calling me Mrs. Costello for the first time. The name felt right. It felt like a perfect, solid piece of armor. I linked my arm through his, feeling the familiar, dangerous strength of him. The blood ruby on my finger caught the light, a perfect dark echo of the soul of the man beside me. I looked at him, and a slow, wicked smile spread across my face. "Let them wait," I told him. It wasn't just about making an entrance. It was about making a statement. The king and queen would arrive on their own time, by their own rules. Together we walked out of that suite, leaving the private moment behind. We stepped into the shadows of the hallway, ready to face our world, no longer just a monster and his captive, but two halves of a single dark and powerful soul. There is a moment in this story that most people miss. It isn't the gunfight. It isn't the kiss in the rain. It isn't even the blood-red ruby slipped onto her finger at the end. The moment that defines everything happens in the very beginning. A young nurse, alone in a trauma bay, pulling on a pair of gloves while armed men fill the room around her. No one asked her to step forward. No one would have blamed her for stepping back. But her hands were steady, and that one quiet act of courage rewrote the entire course of her life. This is not a love story dressed in darkness. This is a story about identity, about who you become when the world strips away every comfort zone you have ever known. Maddie Foster did not walk into Gabriel Costello's world because she was brave. She walked in because she was true to herself, even when being herself was the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. She was a nurse. She healed. That was her nature. And no amount of fear, no gun, no monster in an expensive suit could make her abandon that nature. That is the first lesson this story carries. Your greatest protection is never a weapon. It is an unbreakable sense of who you are. The second lesson lives in Gabriel himself, and it is one that is deeply uncomfortable to admit. This man, ruthless, violent, commanding empires from the shadows, was undone not by a rival, not by betrayal, not by war. He was undone by a woman who simply refused to be impressed by him. In a life where every single person either feared him or wanted something from him, Maddie's indifference was the most disorienting force he had ever encountered. She looked at his wound, not his power. She saw his pain, not his throne. And that honest, unsentimental gaze broke through 35 years of armor in 45 minutes. The lesson here is profound. The person who needs nothing from you is the only person you will ever truly trust. The third lesson is perhaps the hardest. Maddie loses herself, but she also finds herself. The woman who descends that staircase in an emerald gown, who stands before 10 dangerous men and does not flinch, who sentences a betrayer with a cold, steady voice, that woman was always inside the exhausted night shift nurse. She simply needed a fire hot enough to forge her. This story asks us a question we rarely want to answer honestly. Are the circumstances destroying you, or are they revealing you? Because that is what darkness does when you refuse to surrender to it. It does not consume you, it illuminates you. Maddie did not become powerful because Gabriel gave her power. She became powerful because she carried her values, her ethics, her steadiness, her refusal to be bought into the most lawless place imaginable, and she refused to leave them at the door. She rebuilt a criminal empire around a code of honor. No civilian casualties, no collateral damage, clinics in forgotten communities, a queen who still remembered what it meant to heal. That is the final truth this story leaves us with. Power without principle is just violence with better tailoring. But when a person of genuine character steps into the center of chaos and refuses to compromise their core, they do not just survive. They transform everything around them. You do not need a throne to understand this lesson. You need only one thing: the courage to remain entirely, unmistakably yourself, especially in the rooms where everyone is telling you that who you are is not enough. Because in the end, that is exactly what makes you unforgettable. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.